We're going to talk about how to be successful with trees in Colorado, and particularly we're going to focus on how to do it in the most water-wise, most water efficient way that we can. So we'll start out with a little discussion about like why it's a hard place to be a tree, and then we'll get into a little bit about the biology of most trees so we can understand how to care for them, not too much of that stuff, and then we'll end with some species selection ideas. So my email address is here at the bottom. You're more than welcome to send personal questions about your yard to me as well afterwards. But we will stop in the middle for at least one Q&A and then have a Q&A at the end. So all the preamble aside, let's get into it. So um, Colorado, particularly the Front Range, is a very difficult place to be a tree. If you've been trying to grow trees around here, if you're maintaining trees, like it's hard to get them started. We have very arid climate, and the truth is that before Europeans settled the plains here, there was not there were not trees. They would have only been by the rivers and streams and in the foothills. On top of that, we have unfortunately, um, well, it's not that large, but a number of invasive pests, and the list seems to grow that are making it hard to plant certain species of trees that have been a problem. And then our climate certainly isn't getting any easier for trees as well. We have a lot of sudden frosts in the spring and fall, which are very difficult, very problematic for a lot of trees. A lot of trees that were pretty reliable, um, here are like blue spruce and a couple other species are just not dealing with those sudden late and early frosts that we've had in recent years. So it's a hard place to be a tree be here. So we have to give trees extra care. We have to give them extra attention, opposed to if you live like in Ohio or someplace where it's a lot easier to be a tree. So one of the things I think is most important to understand about trees, particularly like through this Waterwise lens, is their root system. So this is a pretty good representation of what a tree's root system looks like. Generally speaking, they are much wider than the canopy of the tree, 2 to 5 times, or sometimes even further. There are some like native junipers that can have root systems that go tens of times the diameter of the canopy, scavenging for water. But they're wide is the take-home message. And generally they're shallow. It's a big misconception, even among some people who are really good plant people, that trees have these really deep root systems. And that's just not true. I'll give you some stats about it later. There are situations where trees may be really deep rooted, but generally speaking, most of the roots in a clayey soil like we have most of the Front Range, are going to be within the top 12 inches. So the root system starts where the trunk, which is a shoot, meets or goes into the soil. So there's this flare, we call it the root flare, and that's the start of the root system. This is like really healthy. If you see a tree that goes into the ground like a telephone pole without a flare, that's usually a sign that something has gone wrong. Usually the tree was planted too deep, and that can actually be a big problem for the long-term health of the tree. Coming up from there we have what's called the root plate. You don't got to worry about that terminology, but it's an area like 3 times or so the diameter of the trunk, and that's where most of the main structural roots are. We don't want to do much like work digging of the soil or trenching underneath the tree's canopy, but we definitely don't want to do it within the root plate. So that area right by the trunk, 3 times the size of the trunk or so, is an area where we don't want to do any digging. We don't want to be planting flowers. We don't want to be trenching there for sprinklers if we can help it, because that's where structural roots are. So that's just something to keep in mind. When you get out from there, you have 2 main different types of roots that make up the rest of the tree's root systems. There are the big roots, which are, maybe up to like 12 inches in diameter, but usually they're like inches in diameter, like, somewhere from 1 to 12. But these roots are mostly there to provide support. And they also store stuff. So they store like starch and stuff like that. So the tree, a tree makes all that through photosynthesis in its leaves and stores it in all of its woody tissues, including the roots. So that's like the energy the tree needs. It's kind of being stored in the roots. They also are the conduits for water to move from the finer roots that absorb water to the tree's trunk and then up to its leaves to be used in photosynthesis and also to keep like the leaves rigid and things like that. But these bigger roots, the roots that are, half an inch and up, don't really absorb any water or nutrients. That's not their primary function. A taproot is a specialized type of woody root. We don't tend to get taproots on most trees here along the Front Range. There's just not enough oxygen at deeper levels of soil to support their growth. Some trees may have them, but generally speaking, we don't get taproots on trees here in Colorado once the tree, is grown out of being a seedling. There also may be sinker roots. These are roots that go deeper down to like find like aquifers and things like that. And I think there's a big assumption by a lot of people that as a tree grows, it's going to develop these deep roots and the tree's just going to find water in the soil. And that's just generally does not happen in landscape settings in Colorado. We can occasionally get like by lakes and streams, um, this may happen with like cottonwoods, but it's not that common in a landscape setting, and there's not usually water shallow enough in most Colorado landscapes for trees to access it. So trees aren't going to just find an aquifer and live off of that by developing these sinker roots. So the final type of root, and where we'll kind of like leave our little discussion of tree biology here behind, is the fine feeder roots. These are small roots, usually less than about a half inch or so in diameter. They are where the primary sites where water and nutrients are absorbed. Nutrients are almost always absorbed as being, they're dissolved in the water, and that's how they come into the tree. The really cool or interesting, anyways, thing about these roots is they are relatively short-lived. A tree will grow several flushes of these fine feeder roots during every growing season, and they grow, and then they die during one growing season. And so when you're taking care of trees, actually, if you kill a flush of these fine feeder roots by not watering the tree correctly, compaction around the tree, or like maybe there's even like a temperature fluctuation that kills these fine feeder roots, you can really stress the tree out because you will set its water absorption back by sometimes, weeks or something like that. So it can really be stressful for the tree, um, even having like temporary drought for some trees. They need a lot of they need oxygen, so they need a well aerated soil, which means like not compacted, um, to really do what they need to do. They are also the area that is these fine feeder roots that are colonized by like beneficial fungi and other microbes, but primarily fungi. So these are mycorrhizae, and they are a fungi that gets sugar from the tree, essentially carbohydrates from the tree, that the tree makes through photosynthesis, and in return they give the tree water and nutrients that the tree couldn't otherwise access. Um, they can increase drought resistance of the tree and also help with disease resistance as well. So mycorrhizae are pretty cool. Adding them to the soil may not get you much benefit, but they're present in most of our soils. And if the conditions are right, you're probably going to get these relationships developing on their own if they're possible. They're really cool relationships. Actually, like the general relationship between plants and mycorrhizae is probably the reason like plants were able to get out of the ocean and onto land. So really important relationships. And if you're doing everything else right, they'll probably develop on their own in most landscape situations. So we already talked about the size, 2 times the width of the canopy. So it's not a mirror. Like this is a piece of art I think I saw on a Starbucks wall where there's like this root system that looks like a mirror of the canopy. That's not what it's like. The root system is wide and shallow. And so we want to respect the tree's root system, which means not overly compacting in that wide area. And that's also the area where we irrigate. And I'll talk about that in a second. Not like that. Generally speaking, the system is shallow. If the soils are like a good soil that's not disturbed, not compacted, the tree's root system may be deeper as well. And then some trees, of course, have deeper root systems than others. There's some genetic variability there as well. Tree roots also tend to be shallower in clay soils, and we have clay soils here in Colorado. So we tend to have shallower rooted trees here. And interestingly, trees also are more shallow or more shallowly rooted in sandy soils as well, but for entirely different reasons. Sandy soils tend to drain really rapidly, so all the water is near the surface. Or whether trees, sorry, all tree roots tend to amass near the surface to capture water from rain because the sandy soils can't hold any water. It just drains through them. So the tree puts all their roots at the surface to capture before it gets away. So if your soil is overly compacted, which is really common in urban settings, right? Soils are compacted during construction, so they're smashed, and all the little pores that would hold water, and even the bigger pores that, especially the bigger pores actually that would hold oxygen and other gases are forced out of the soil during compaction, which we do in construction to make soil strong, so foundations won't crack and things like that, which is also important. Um, so soils that have low oxygen or they have like a high water table, you tend to get really shallow rooted trees in those situations too. So this is a bunch of text, but the rule of thumb is that in a clay soil, 90% of the roots are going to be in the top 12 inches and 50% will actually be in the top four. In a better soil, 90% of the roots will be in the top 3 feet, but 50% will still be in the top 12 inches, even in a better soil, which better soils don't really exist in landscape situations, generally speaking. Um, and then a last note, generally roots come out like radially, like the spokes of a wheel. That's what we'd go for in a landscape setting. Sometimes we've got like physical obstructions to the roots, like curbs and things. But generally a tree wants its roots to come out radially like this so that it, for stable, so one, it can scavenge for water better and nutrients better, but two, it's stabilized, from against wind and things like that. And like if you live along the Front Range, we get some wind, including over the weekend. Um, So soil, root growth is, we've kind of talked about the root system is. We want to have a healthy root system for our tree to be successful. The number one limiting factor, for most plants in urban situations is low soil oxygen and then improper care. So roots need oxygen to do respiration. That's what makes energy from the photosynthesis makes sugars, and respiration takes those sugars and makes them into usable energy that allows the tree to do work with them. So roots need oxygen to do root things. And so I've already kind of talked about why soils are low in oxygen, compaction, they're wet. Sometimes we mulch them too deeply. That can be another reason I see with trees a lot is that we're trying to use wood mulch or some other sort of mulch around the tree on the soil. And if it's placed more than about 4 inches deep, oxygen diffuses through it more so slowly. So you can get low soil oxygen due to that. Um, on top of that, compaction, along with the lowering soil oxygen levels, just makes the soil harder for roots to grow through. It's just harder for roots to penetrate the soil. So these are big issues. And then in landscapes, a thing that is just unfortunately true, I do a lot of visits looking at people's landscapes, is that more landscapes are harmed with over watering or too much love, if you want to think about it, than too little love. And this is true for trees too. Um, Soils where all the pores, all the little blank spots in the soil are always filled with water, tend to have, I mean, because all the pores are full of water, there's less oxygen in the soil. As the soil drains, there's more and more blank, empty spaces that can be filled with air. So if you're always overwatering, you can be damaging a tree's root system by reducing the amount of oxygen. So, and that happens a lot. It happens a depressingly large amount that the landscape soils are being overwatered. And there's a ton of savings out there just from correctly watering soils. And I'm sure some of these watering landscapes. I'm sure some of these seminars are going to go into that. Um, on top of that, we can do other things to damage a tree's root system. So these are big no-nos if you're into your trees. These are things to definitely avoid. One, changing the grade of the soil around the tree. Adding a bunch of soil around the tree, like is happening in this picture, will make it so the roots are buried and there'll be less oxygen under all that depth of soil, less oxygen diffusing from the atmosphere because it has to go further. And you will kill tree roots like that and eventually kill trees. The same is true actually for lowering the grade, but it's like different reasoning, right? Like if you lower the grade, you just cut the tree's roots and damage them, and you'll harm the tree that way. So we don't want to change the grade around trees. And then here's what I was talking about: improper mulching. We call this a mulch volcano, where the mulch is like piled up and then it has a little divot. Mulching is great for trees. There's a lot of really good research to show that wood mulch in particular is very good for trees' root systems. But what you want is about a 3 or 4 inch deep layer of wood mulch, consistently the same depth around the tree, and then you don't want the mulch touching the bark of the tree. It's not going to like be the end of the world if a little bit of mulch touches it, but we don't want like a pile of mulch up against the tree holding water there, potentially leading to rot and things like that. And then another type of mulching is like plastic mulching, which like, so this is that black sheet plastic. They call it weed barrier, which is like great marketing, but that's not how that works, right? Like weed barrier keeps out the weeds for a bit until soil blows in on top of it. And then the weeds root through it. And then the weeds are super hard to pull once they're rooting through it. Also, like I'm sure we're all not living in, caves or something. Everyone's heard of microplastic pollution in our water and probably in our bodies, and think we don't really know what the consequences of that are. But I don't think carpeting the earth in black plastic is probably a great plan, or even plastic fabric is a great plan in terms of that for the future. So, we don't really recommend using plastic mulch, either woven or sheet plastic mulches in landscapes. Bad for the root systems. Um, so So I already talked about this. I already rambled. I rambled too early. I kind of just got too excited. Um, I do want to. So I think an interesting thing, if you care about plants, if you have a landscape, is to know a little bit about how plants get water out of the soil. So, um, let's imagine in our head, everyone can just close their eyes and relax and think about it. You have some soil, okay, and it's dry. And then we either irrigate or rain. It rains. You can imagine whichever one you want. Irrigation is obviously more common in Colorado. It rains. So the water comes from above the soil and starts moving into the pores of the soil. The water is actually attracted to the soil particles like a magnet. The water has a negative charge on one end and a positive charge on the other. The soil has a negative charge. So the negative charge of the soil attracts the positive end of a water molecule, just like magnets. It's no more complicated than that. So water starts moving around the soil particles, coating them, and then forming chains of water molecules, positive to negative, out from the soil surface. In the small pores in the soil, so small spaces in the soil that are empty, like so you can see like these gaps here, these would be the pores, right? The small spaces, the mass of the water that accumulates in them is not great enough that gravity can pull it out. So water is retained in those pores. The large pores drain. The mass of water in them is big enough that gravity is now the strongest force, and it pulls the water out and they drain. So they're filled with air. And that air has oxygen that roots need. So we want a mix of large and small pores to both hold water and to drain and be filled with air. So you irrigate in our scenario, and the pores start filling up. Some of the water drains away from gravity, takes it away, and plants can't use it. The remaining water that's held in the soil, once gravity has drained the water away, we call that field capacity. It's a fancy term, but that means that it's the amount of water a soil can hold against gravity. That water is then some of it evaporates from the surface, some of it's used by plants, and it starts being depleted, till we get to the point that the remaining water in the soil is held too tightly in the soil particles for plants to use. The plants permanently wilt, which is just a fancy way to say that they die due to drought. So, when we water a tree, an area with the tree, or really any landscape setting, we're mostly trying to water to field capacity so we don't lose water to gravity. And we're going to re-irrigate before our plants die at wilting point. If we water to saturation, we're losing water or past saturation, we're losing water to gravity pulling it away. And if we wait too long here to re-irrigate, if we stress our plants too much, they die, which is also a bad sustainability outcome. Growing plants is very carbon intensive. We don't want to be replacing plants. That's not good for the planet, so we want to walk that line. Okay, um, so that's just a little bit to understand like how water works. Maybe it's really, I'd like to put a little science in here just, for fun. But so when we water a tree in particular, we are going to water where the roots are. So we've had the discussion about, where the roots are. They're wider than the canopy and they're pretty shallow. So we want to water from somewhere about halfway in the tree's canopy, where that white line is here on our chart, out to about a distance twice the size of a tree's canopy. That's the best, where this arrow is. That's the best area to irrigate. If that's too big an area, or in your landscape, maybe you don't even have soil that big, you're just going to water from about this halfway point to an area a little beyond the tree's canopy, and that's probably good enough. When we water a tree, we want to water deeply and infrequently. We want to water so the top foot or foot and a half of soil is wet. Um, and then let the soil start drying out. And usually when the top about 3 inches, about the length of your finger, when the soil is dry, that's time to irrigate again. Again, there are very few trees, and I'll give you them what they are, but there are very, very few trees that can survive without supplemental irrigation along the front range. A tree along the front range is going to require some irrigation, would be another way of saying that. Now, if you select the correct species, you can really reduce the amount of irrigation it needs. If you plant it correctly, you can really reduce the amount of irrigation it needs. Um, and if you use things like wood mulch, you can also cut down irrigation. There are some tips and tricks, but trees are going to need to be irrigated. In terms of how to water them, I think there is this still a persistent myth. Oh, I already gave it away. I loaded the question too much. This is a needle used for watering. You hook a hose up to it, and then you shove this needle 3 feet in the ground, and it's supposed to water a tree's root system. It's supposed to water a tree. Well, based on our understanding of a tree's root system, I was supposed to make you think about this, and I just gave you all the answers. So I guess I'm just going to give up and tell you. Remember, a tree's roots aren't at 3 feet. They're more at 12 inches. And a tree's root aren't just right around they're not just one little spot in the soil. They're this big area under the canopy that needs to be watered. So this device waters too deeply and too small of an area to really be effective. It would be better for the tree just to water with the sprinkler. Don't do that. I guess you could put it in just like 12 inches in the soil so you're not watering too deeply, but you still have to move the silly needle all over around the tree. So a sprinkler's probably better. Here are some other things, some other ideas to be efficient. This is drip tape put under the canopy of the tree. This is not the best staking job, but this is drip tape put underneath the tree. So it's watering, it's dripped, it's got emitters that drip water out all throughout the line. So it waters very slowly, very effectively, but because of this tape, we're still watering the whole root system of the tree. Very effective. These are called orchard sprinklers, or sometimes called bubblers or micro sprinklers. So they're sprinklers, but they're very close to the ground. They usually irrigate a 6 foot diameter or so. They come in different types, but it uses big droplets and they're close to the ground, so it waters very efficiently. It hooks right up to your drip system, but it waters a bigger area and it waters from the top down, all of which is better for trees. So either of these would be better examples. Those would be good. And there are some more abstract ideas here. This is the 5-gallon bucket method. So for a newly planted tree, these buckets have holes drilled in the bottom of them. You fill them up and let the water slowly drip out the holes, so it waters slowly, so the water is not lost to runoff. Probably only good for newly planted trees. Here we have another drip system. This is a soaker hose, which is the same as drip, except it weeps all along its length, and it doesn't last as long. It kind of falls apart after a season or two, so I prefer the drip tape personally. Or just an old-fashioned hose. Hose and sprinklers water very slowly normally, so they're very efficient ways to water things. So a hose and a sprinkler is just fine as well. So use one of those methods, and then the other question is how much? Well, in extension, we give out this recommendation that says we use approximately 10 gallons of water per inch of trunk diameter at your chest height. And we water we add 10 gallons of water per inch of diameter, and then we water when the top few inches of soil are dry, which would depend on rain and other factors. So there's not a definite cycle. It's when the top few inches are dry. I don't know where this recommendation came from. We repeated an extension, and it seems to be pretty good. I don't think this came from a research study or something, but it's just a rule of thumb. So if it's a 1-inch tree, we'd recommend watering with 10 gallons of water, and you'd water when the top few inches of soil have dried out, which might be every 2 weeks or might be every 6 days, depending on the time of year and how hot it is and things like that. So we also really, as I already said, we really recommend using wood chip mulch and to encourage a healthy root system. I don't have this picture in the talk, but there was research done at the Morton Arboretum in Chicago where they actually used these radioactive but not harmful isotopes in water to take pictures of roots, and the tree roots under wood mulch were almost, I believe, twice as many fine feeder roots under wood mulch as under other substances like turf or bare earth. So wood mulch really encourages tree roots by moderating soil temperature because it acts as a blanket and kind of moderates the isolations in soil temperature. It also helps the soil retain a little water and adds some organic matter to the soil as it decomposes. Aeration is also would also be helpful for a tree's root system. So this is aeration and turf, where they pull out all those cores, and people always think it's like goose poop or something as a joke. That's good for turf roots and will save you water with turf, but also will help with trees. And then I've already talked about avoiding compaction, backfilling, things like that. So these are some tips you can use to encourage your tree to have a healthy root system. So let's pause here, and if there's any questions in the Q&A, this is a good chance I can try to answer some of them.
Ye- Yeah, let me just pop in and go through the ones. So one of them was about, is grass, you mentioned wood mulch being very good for the trees, is if you've got lawn right up to the edge of the tree, is that bad for the tree?
Yeah, it's not ideal. Like a lot of trees will survive that way, but it can hold moisture up against the trunk and lead to rot diseases. So, we would really recommend putting an area around the tree that is wood mulch or something like that to give the tree a little area just for itself, and not hold that water next to the tree. So, the research really says the best thing for a tree's health, believe it or not, would be to have wood mulch out to its drip line. But for a lot of landscapes, that would mean you have nothing but wood mulch, which maybe that's fine. But, for a lot of people, that's kind of like, I'd rather, not have that. So just do as big a circle as you can tolerate is kind of our advice on that with wood mulch.
Okay, great. And another question was specifically about the emerald ash borer. Does the treatment work and does it save the tree?
Yeah, there is definitely effective treatments for emerald ash borer. The best ones are going to be injections, and almost all the tree care companies now are using emamectin benzoate, which is, if you Google emerald ash borer treatment, it's going to come up. That is very safe for the tree, for the environment, and it's very effective for emerald ash borer. There are some like tricks, like if your tree is more than like half dead or lost more than maybe even about a third of its canopy, probably that's not going to be an effective treatment. So you gotta do it early. Um, and the tree needs to be healthy in general for it to work, but it is very effective with healthy trees. It also has the plus that you only have to do it every 2 years. And it's really come down in price because the product has become generic recently. So if you have a nice ash tree you want to save, you definitely can, but you'll have to treat it for the life of the tree. So if the tree's not a nice tree, it probably is better just to think about starting over. Hopefully that makes sense. I could do a whole talk on about ash borer. That's my 2-minute elevator speech on it.
Great, thank you. So one person is interested in looking for something flowering to provide color that can grow fairly fast. Are you going to give any recommendations later on about trees? Because
That's
we
what
can.
we're doing next is recommendations.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hold off on that question. Another person was curious about potential damage due to a tree root being cut 4 feet from the trunk of an older locust tree. Would that have damaged the tree?
Oh yeah, I mean it really depends. If it's this one root that was cut, the tree will probably survive. If there was a trench 4 feet from the trunk, like a big long trench dug, and more roots were cut, that's probably a more serious issue. The depth of the trench, all that would matter. But at this point, it's happened. So you're really talking about just, what I would recommend is taking good care of the tree. So using some of the things we talked about with watering, winter water it. If we have dry months in the winter, just baby that tree a little bit if it's one you really want to keep to help it kind of recover from that. Trees are resilient. Oh, mature trees can't, they can come back from things like that. But if they did a big long trench, it probably is stressing the tree somewhat. So a little extra water, a little more attention to its care would probably be good.
Great. And what about tree spike fertilizers? Beneficial, not beneficial?
Yeah. Fertilizers in trees is the research is super interesting with fertilizers in trees. Generally speaking, even though like I'm very much for sustainable landscaping, I tell people, well, we need to provide nutrients for our landscape somehow. They're not natural systems, they're not closed systems, they need to be fertilized to be healthy and avoid disease. Because if you have disease, then you have to maybe treat the disease, and like you into this whole cycle. So, short answer is the research on fertilizing trees is super mixed, and generally it does not seem to support fertilizing landscape trees, especially trees that are growing in turf. They probably get all the fertilizer they need from what's done for the turf. If a tree is growing in rocks, giving it a fertilizer with a low nitrogen number, so that's the first number on the bag, a low nitrogen number like 10 or less may provide some benefit. Fertilizing trees with a fertilizer that's a high nitrogen number um, can lead to a lot of shoot growth at the expense of root growth, unbalancing the canopy and the root system and leading to long-term stress. So if a tree's in turf, the take home is you don't need to worry about fertilizing it if it's in turf. If it's in rocks, maybe use a low nitrogen number, but the research really says you probably don't even need to do that.
Great. And then we'll get to a couple more and then we'll get back on track. Someone
Sure.
asked about the watering guidelines, that great chart you showed. Would that guideline change for aspens since they have a very different root system, or would it be the same?
No, the guideline wouldn't change. Aspens root systems, of course, are a little different. I mean, they sucker from their roots. That's the big thing that's different with aspens. They also tend to be a little more shallowly rooted. I would say if you're trying to grow aspens, for one, if you're looking to plant a tree, don't plant an aspen along the Front Range. It's a Colorado tree. It belongs up in the mountains. It is full of problems down here. It is short-lived. Don't so if you're making a choice, don't plant one. But I have inherited aspens places I live, and so if you're trying to get the most number of years you can of an aspen, and down here, really 10 to 20 years is about the life of an aspen down here at lower elevations. But if you're trying to get the most out of it, watering is super important. And it's really going to like consistently moist, but not sopping wet soil. So you're going to maybe water a little more often with a little less water with aspen to keep that soil consistently moist, but not sopping wet. But all the other things would apply to aspens as well, like the size of the root system, the depth, all that stuff. So hopefully that answers the question.
And then we'll get to two more questions, then we'll hold off and wait till more
Sure.
close to the end. And that's basically a couple people have asked about alternatives to wood mulch, and they were wondering about rocks or cardboard to kind of keep the weeds down.
Yeah, so cardboard can be very useful as like a short-term way to like suppress turf and maybe kill it. So you put cardboard down and then you put something heavy like wood mulch or rocks on top of it to smother the turf and to keep weeds out. It'll work till it decomposes, you know. And that might take a long time in Colorado because we have a dry climate. So nothing wrong with that. Um, Rocks, I do not generally like rock mulch in landscapes, with exceptions like xeric gardens and things. Rock mulch might make sense, but rock mulch, I think the view of it is that it's really low maintenance, and that's just not the case. We get enough water from the sky that rock mulch will get weedy, and you'll be pulling or spraying weeds from it for life. And rock mulch does nothing to improve the soil like wood mulch does. So it's inert, it just sits there, it gets weedy, it gets dirty. Um, I don't like rock mulch for most situations personally. Again, except for like really heat-loving xeric plants, because that's the other thing about rock mulch is it gets hot. So, and then finally, my other thing, since these classes have a sustainability bent, is that wood mulch, organic mulch, is a waste product, and by using it in landscapes, we keep it out of a landfill, right? Like we find a beneficial use for something that didn't have a good use. Rock mulch is quarried and shipped in giant trucks that consume a bunch of diesel fuel. The quarrying consumes a bunch of diesel fuel and then spread out. So I don't think if your sustainability is if you really love rock mulch, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. But if sustainability is your goal, rock mulch really, for most situations, is not what you want to go with. Um, from my perspective, sustainability is tricky. It's a really tricky thing to think about. But from my perspective, rock mulch would be not my number one choice, except for non-people areas. The best place I ever saw rock mulch was a visit I did at the Denver County Jail, and they had a bunch of rock mulch between the cell blocks, which is like a defensible space for that. So that's for non-people spaces, rock mulch might be okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Eric. We'll let you get back and we'll get to some of these other questions at the end.
Yeah, we should have plenty of time at the end, it's looking like. So thank you. Okay, so we're going to shift now to talking about selection. There are the two most important things to have success with trees, if you're starting from scratch, are picking the right tree and planting it correctly. So we're going to talk first about how to pick the right tree. I'm going to break it down by size because I find that's how people, think about trees. It is really important to pick the tree that has the correct mature size for your landscape. It's not going to be too big. So these are going to be some selections for small trees. A lot of these are going to be your ornamental flowering trees like someone asked about. And I'm going to start with what is my favorite of all the flowering, smaller ornamental flowering trees, just personal favorite, and that's Russian hawthorn. This is a hawthorn that's native to the steppes of Asia, Mongolia, and places like that, where they have a very, very similar climate to here in Colorado. It is nearly completely xeric. So what I mean by that is that it really doesn't need supplemental irrigation once it's established. So you have to water it to get it going. Now during really dry periods, it's going to appreciate a little water, but it's very, very low water use plant. And then it just has all these beautiful features. My picture behind me here on my Zoom is actually Russian hawthorn, but the flowers are pretty. Pollinators love them. In the spring, gorgeous flower show, which becomes these fruits, the hawthorns, right? The fruits are eaten by birds generally, so they don't make a huge mess on the ground under the tree. They're not eaten by birds until they freeze, which is kind of cool. A bird person told me that. I'm not a birder, but I was told that, and I looked it up, and it's a kind of a cool fact. So they persist into the winter and are kind of showy at the start of the fall. Once there's a hard freeze, birds start eating them, so they don't make a huge nest below the tree. It also gets a very nice yellow fall color. So this is a plant that's low water use, has pretty flowers, pretty fruit. Birds love the fruit, pretty yellow fall color, and even interesting bark, which is not in my picture here. So it is really a nice ornamental tree for our area, and one that you can find a lot more readily than you used to be able to around here now. A native to the southwest part of the state that's a little smaller, you might think about. You'd have to go to a native plant nursery to probably find this one, like Harlequin Gardens or another native plant nursery. We have a lot of great nurseries along the Front Range. Is hop tree. This is Petilia trifoliata is the name, which is kind of fun to say. It gets a beautiful golden yellow fall color, otherwise not very showy, but it's a nice native smaller tree that is almost completely, like truly xeric is why it's in this talk, even though it's hard to find. Does not need much water at all once established. Uh, of another very low water use, so maybe not much irrigation needed, ornamental tree here is Panicle Golden Rain Tree. This was the state champion at Denver Botanic Gardens, and it has since gone. I don't actually know if it failed or if it was just removed for construction. So this is as big as they ever get. Most of them don't get this big. It has these pretty yellow flowers midsummer, so after most things are done flowering, a nice yellow fall color, and then it gets these papery fruits that look like lanterns, and that's why it gets the name Golden Lantern Tree. Very, very tough, very heat, very drought tolerant. It is weak wooded though, so you want to pay attention with your pruning on this one and keep the lateral branches small, so it doesn't come apart in a storm later in its life. They are very susceptible to storm damage. And the last really low water use one of these trees I want to talk about is our native oak. This is sometimes called scrub oak. Gamble oak is the name I use, and it's the scrubby sort of suckering oak that's native to most of the foothills along the Front Range. So it does not need a supplemental water once established. Very drought tolerant. Sometimes they get a little fall color. They do need their space though. They do want to sucker and form a thicket just like they do in the mountains. So it's nice for an edge of the yard or a border where it can do that. It's not going to be polite and just be a single stem plant for you most of the time. I also put in here big tooth maple. This is one that's a little harder to find, but if you want fall color, if that's your primary thing, some of these big tooth maples have just really nice pumpkin orange fall color. Um, there are different selections. This is Manzano from the Manzano Mountains of New Mexico. It's more of a tree form. So a lot of these big tooth maples are like large shrubs, but this is more of a tree form. And there you can see the fall color. Very fast growing, which normally I don't like in a tree, but I think it's okay with this one. And this is becoming a little more common in the trade. So if you want fall color, this is one that you might think about that again is quite drought tolerant. A little less than maybe the other ones we've talked about here, but pretty drought tolerant. Moving down the spectrum, we have Hot Wings Maple. This is a small ornamental maple. This particular one I have here is Hot Wings. That's the one Plant Select promotes because it has these red fruits, which are the hot wings, right? Which are very ornamentally showy. Again, this is very low water use, but a little supplemental irrigation during dry periods for sure with this one. Very commonly available. You can find this one at most local garden centers. It also has a nice white flower. You can see there honeybee on it, so pollinators like it. And the flowers become these red winged fruits, which are very showy. So that gives it an elongated season of interest, which is nice. The fall color is not bad either, depending on the year. So those are some smaller trees you might think about. Some shade trees you might think about. These are the bigger trees for larger landscapes, mostly to provide shade. And none of these are as drought tolerant as those ones I just showed you. These are all going to need some supplemental irrigation. The first one is that I want to talk about is bur oak. This is a oak that's native to a lot of the eastern part of the country. Bur oak is a really cool tree. It's not like super showy. The fall color is just pale yellow, kind of sickly color. It's not that attractive. No flowers that are very attractive. The fruit is an acorn, like you see here, with this kind of cool mossy cup, but it's not like showy, like in a flowery sort of way. Um, so ornamentally, it's kind of dull, but it is a very reliable tree and a very tough, quite a tough tree here along the Front Range. So the silly analogy I always use is like everybody has like a friend who's like not the most exciting person. You're probably not going to call them to go on a Saturday night or whatever, but they own a truck and they'll be there to help you move when to help you move. And that's what bur oak is. It's a reliable tree along here. The only problem it really gets are these little galls, which are caused by a non-stinging wasp. And so it's usually an ornamental problem rather than anything that's actually going to kill the tree. But this is something that there's a genetic predisposition to. So the best defense against it is actually just buying a tree at the nursery that doesn't have any of the galls. And that means it probably will have less of the galls as it ages. There are several other oaks that are kind of tough. This is English oak. It is not as tough as bur oak, but it's a little more stately. You can see it has this triangular shape. It keeps its leaves brown into the winter, which some people like and other people hate. I kind of like it personally, but I understand a lot of people don't. I unfortunately, I probably, if I had been thinking better, would have taken English oak out of this talk because we have a pest, at least if you live in the metro area, because we have a pest that's kind of making a problem with it called Gamble oak borer that we're not really sure if it's going to be a persistent problem or not. But there are some really exciting high, trees which are crosses with that use English oak that I do think might want to consider. And this one here on the right is the one I like the most. This is Crimson Spire Oak. It's a cross between English oak and white oak. It's going to stay narrow, never more than about 15 feet wide, so it's good for smaller yards. Gets a beautiful red fall color, which comes from the white oak part of its heritage. And it has these little short T-Rex branches that aren't likely to break up in a storm. So even though it's narrow and upright, it seems to be more resistant to storm damage. So if you like a smaller tree that's pretty tough, this cross of English oak called Crimson Spire Oak might be one to consider. We've always had these old traditional upright English oaks, but they tend to come apart in snowstorms. You can see even in this picture, this branch already kind of being pulled out of the canopy. And I don't think that's going to happen with Crimson Spire. So this is one I planted when I lived in Erie, so I practiced what I preached. Yes, there are far too many plants in that small corner of the yard. I was way too ambitious. One of my favorite shade trees, one that I really think that we could consider planting more, is chinkapin oak. This is an oak that's native, again, for a wide range of the eastern part of the country. Most of the ones we grow here are selected from the Flint Hills of Kansas, where they have soils similar to ours. It gets a Merlot color, like a wine color in the fall, which is its best ornamental feature. Has kind of interesting bark and really doesn't seem to mind our soils here. So it is definitely on the more xeric side. Again, it's going to want some supplemental irrigation, but it's not high water use for sure. There's a picture of the fall color just coming on. It will get a little Merlot color normally. These are grown from seed though, so there is some genetic variability in the fall color. Some are really nice, some are just okay. Very quickly, another one that's very common and easy to find that is a very tough tree is Kentucky coffee tree. This is a member of the legume family. Um, it has like these little pods you can kind of see in the picture. And there is one called Espresso that doesn't have those if you care about that. Um, just a pretty reliable tree. You can get a nice yellow fall color some years. The pods will persist into the winter and can be kind of attractive. So, you know, that's not, some people think they're messy. I tend to look on the bright side and say they're attractive. And then I don't let them bug me. I just run them over with the lawnmower or whatever and move on with my life. So, but if you don't like the pods, but you want this tree, Espresso is a variety of Kentucky coffee tree that is podless. A couple other quick ones. Catalpa here is or sometimes called northern catalpa, is a beautiful tree. If you're from the south, you probably know it. It has this really pyramidal shape, flowers in June. The flowers are sweet smelling, but they don't attract a lot of pollinators, which is kind of interesting, or really actually maybe any, I've been told, which is kind of a bummer, but they are very pretty. And it can also get a nice yellow fall color. This is a tree that is pretty drought tolerant, but it really just tolerates drought. It doesn't like thrive in drought. It's not like loving drought. It just kind of survives drought. So I think it's a great addition to have some of these in landscapes. It's probably shouldn't be the number one thing we plant, but if you just love catalpas, they are a good water-wise tree for around these parts. One that I just want to like really drive home because it's one that I'm really excited about are these Cotto type sugar maples. Um, Sugar maples are native to like a big part of the country, but we normally like associate them with the Northeast, right? And the beautiful fall color and everyone going leaf peeping out or whatever you want to say up there to see them, to see the sugar and the red maples in that neck of the woods. And we plant a lot of sugar maple and red maple in Colorado landscapes. And generally speaking, neither of those species are that great in our landscape. Some sugar maples do okay. Red maples are pretty much a no-go. We plant a lot of them because people want to have the tree from back east that they know, but they just don't do really well here. This one, however, is a selection of sugar maple from a naturally occurring population of sugar maple that's growing in Caddo County, Oklahoma. So it's natural population of sugar maples in Oklahoma, where it's hot and they have crummy soils like we do here. So it doesn't tend to get the yellow, the sickly yellow chlorosis that a lot of sugar maples and red maples get in our soils. It does well with our heat, and it still gets the pretty red fall color that sugar maples get. So this is really a tree that to me gives a lot of what people, a lot of what they want from a shade tree in a landscape. It's not a huge towering tree either, maybe tops out 30 to 45 feet. So it's not like the big 100-foot tall cottonwood or something like that, that one day's hazard. So I think it's a tree that has real potential in our landscapes. There's more and more of these being planted all the time. The original ones that were selected by a gentleman named John Parr, and so they're John Parr sugar maples. That's what they're called. But now all the nurseries, all the big national nurseries, are making their own selection that have names like Campfire. There still was John Parr and Discato. So a lot of the tree specific growers now do have these Caddo type sugar maples. And if you want red fall color and a shade tree, this is really one you could think about. So I want to do maybe 20 minutes more of talking or a little less to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Um, I'm now going to do my best used car salesman speech and convince you all that we should plant more junipers. So this one here, so we're going to talk about some evergreens, but this one here is Rocky Mountain juniper. This is a tree that is native to the Front Range, native to the foothills of the Front Range. Um, it is very variable in its habit, its color. You can see the variation here in terms of size and color. And but it's usually multi-stem and it's usually a small tree. And I know if you tell people junipers are a good choice, like they just immediately tune out. They're like, junipers, this person just doesn't know what I like, or what they're talking about. Junipers are the worst. But I think in the dry west, we need to learn to love junipers, and there are junipers out there that are worth loving. There have been superior selections made of many different species of junipers, but for Rocky Mountain in particular, there's been superior selections made that have beautiful blue-green color, almost like a blue spruce, that have nice, really cool upright habits, but don't come apart in snowstorms, that are gray, that bring like really cool things to landscapes. And we also get all the other cool things about junipers. Mainly, they are super heat tolerant, they are super drought tolerant, and those are things that we care about in Colorado landscapes these days. So I think we all gotta just learn to love junipers, and it's not that hard. I've done it. You can do it. So here's some growing in the foothills. You can see more variations of shapes and sizes. And then here's some of those superior selections I was talking about. This is Moonglow, has a beautiful spearmint color to it. It's going to be a, 20-foot tall, 15-foot wide kind of cylindrical shrub great for borders, great in some situations where you might have planted blue spruce, which are not tough, even though they're native. Blue spruce are little princess trees that, sorry, I'm not being trying to be derogatory, but it's always too hot or too cold, like some sort of fairy tale with them, like too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet. Blue spruces are very picky. But this will have that color without any of that, without any of that. And then here we have Woodward, which is an upright one that you can see how beautiful it looks even after a number of years. So if you want an upright juniper, that's one you could really consider. Other ones that are out there that are really not really nice are Gray Gleam and Colo Green, like Colorado green, will be two other superior junipers that you might think about planting. I think that another big piece of this juniper puzzle is that they're oftentimes planted in the wrong spots. You really need to plant junipers or really any conifer in a situation where it'll never need to be pruned, where it can grow to its natural size and just be happy as it is. If we plant them in the wrong spot, they either look really bad or we have to prune them and then they look really funny. Plus, they're not fun to prune. Juniper is the most common minor allergy that people have. That makes your skin irritated. So put them where they can grow to their mature size without being touched, and I bet you'll have a lot less problems with them over time. A couple other evergreens to really quickly talk about. This is pinyon pine. Pinyon pine is native up from Fort Collins and the foothills to parts pretty far south. The picture here is the native pinyon forest in New Mexico, I believe, where they get like 4 inches of rain a year. So obviously they can take it very, very dry. They are a small tree, probably 20 feet-ish, is as tall as they ever get. And I see more pinyon looking bad because they're overwatered than under. They really do want it dry. So if you put this in turf or in a place where it's overwatered, it's gonna get issues. So pinyon is one you can definitely think about if you really don't want to worry about irrigating. Another evergreen, which really is good with dry conditions, is this selection of Arizona cypress. This is a true cypress. It's from a species that, generally speaking, grows south of Colorado. Um, so we didn't think we could grow it here, or when we tried, we used to try, it didn't make it through the winters consistently. But this selection, Cook Peak Arizona cypress, was selected by intrepid plant people who went up Cook Peak, and I believe New Mexico. It might be Arizona, but I think New Mexico. They went up the side of Cook Peak to a high elevation population of these cypresses and made selections from there, brought them back here, and we've been growing them now for 15 or 20 years along the Front Range. And they have that extra cold hardiness because they came from that higher elevation. They seem to get through the winters here very well. There is a big variation with this in terms of shape because we grow them from seed. Some are very upright, some are more pyramidal, some are kind of broader, but it has a beautiful blue-green color, really interesting foliage, really interesting fruit, and again, very, very drought tolerant. So it's one you could definitely think about growing in your landscapes down here along the Front Range. And then finally, I'll wrap up with with the shrubs and things that are like shrubs that you might consider that are very xeric. I think that shrubs are really where a lot of people, if you love flowering plants, woody plants, shrubs are where you can really get creative. There's a lot more choices out there for xeric shrubs. The first one I have is serviceberry. We have a serviceberry that's native to Colorado. There are a lot of other serviceberries that are native on the market, also called Juneberries. Um, Beautiful. So the Saskatoon is one. All leaf. There's a bunch of them out there. Utah ensis is a very small one. That's Utah serviceberry. That's very drought tolerant. This is kind of what they look. This is what all their features kind of look like, though. They've got beautiful white flowers, which become these blueberry-like fruits, which are edible and do make nice jellies, jams, and things like that. And then they usually have a nice fall color too. So they can range depending on which one you're planting, from being like a little basketball-sized shrub up to being a small multi-stem tree, depending on the species. So just look at what you're planting in the nursery. They all are drought tolerant, but some are more drought tolerant than others. Shadow bow is another one that's not as drought tolerant. I think it's a great one. Even if you don't pick the fruit, this fruit supports birds and wildlife, which is also pretty cool. If you want edible fruit, another one you could think about is gooseberry. Gooseberry is a very tough shrub. Plant Select has one called Comanche. There's other ones out there. They're all very drought tolerant. They make gooseberries, which are tasty, especially when they're ripe. They are a little tart, especially if you pick them early, but they're good for, again, jams, jellies. People like to put them on ice cream. but they're a very tough plant, little shrub that's going to make you some edible fruit that you might think about. There's a picture of Comanche, I believe. Here's a little one growing. This is actually a currant, but currants are in the same family, and there are a lot of really tough currants too out there. They get these little fruits or flowers that aren't that showy, and then those become the fruit. One of my favorites, and this was a shrub that I think oftentimes is like really polarizing. People either love it or hate it, is Apache plume. This is again native to the state. Native is weird, right? Because is it native to the Front Range? Is it native to the mountains? Is it native to by the river on the Front Range or up on the plains? Like native's a tricky thing too, but this one is native. It looks like it looks so Western to me. Like this is a plant of the West. So often in places like Colorado where there's a lot of transplants, we're trying to bring plants in from elsewhere to like give our landscapes the character of the Midwest. And frankly, we should just embrace where we are. We should embrace a Western aesthetic, I think. Maybe I'm being a little too forced with that, but I think it'd be cool if we did embrace a Western aesthetic a little more and kind of our own unique styles to landscapes. And Apache Plume definitely has that. It has these little white flowers that develop into the poofy fruit. So the poofs are actually the fruit, the little Dr. Seuss things. Very xeric plants. Pollinators supports native pollinators. Um, it looks a little like a tumbleweed in winter, which maybe throws people off, but I don't let that bother me. Um, just a really cool xeric shrub for here that again, like, can't you just see like someone riding by that, like on a, you know, horse or something? It just feels very Western to me. So, um, there's just another picture of the flowers as they're just starting to open. There are several lead plants, which are going to be very similar. They are very xeric. These are members of the legume family. They get these cool, like pea-shaped flowers, and these that are born in groups. Very, very drought tolerant. In fact, if you give it too much water, it's probably going to take over. Great habitat plants. One a great shrub we could really think about planting more of around. It will spread if it gets too much water though, so just keep that in mind. There's a close up of the flowers. You can see the kind of orange pollen, which is pretty cool. My personal favorite, which is just again, I admit this is just a personal preference of these xeric shrubs, is actually fern bush. It has these leaves which have a ferny character to them, and it gets these white flowers, and it blooms for a very long period of time towards the end of summer, through the middle, from the middle towards the end of summer. Pollinators love it. Very drought tolerant. Probably tops out. The biggest ones you see are like 6 feet ish. A lot of them are shorter than that, but just a beautiful plant, very drought tolerant, very interesting leaves. The leaves hang on the plant late into the fall, so it provides some fall interest too. One of my just personal favorite shrubs to grow here. Here you can see the close-up of the flowers um, there as well. If you're looking for a ground cover, one that is really tough here is another native. One shrub that's really tough here is skunk bush sumac. This is there are many types of skunk bush sumac, also called three-leaf sumac. Skunk bush sumac is not a great marketing name, right? And it does not reek. The plant doesn't reek, so don't let the name throw you off. This is a native sumac. The ones that I really think probably have the best place in our landscapes are the ground cover types. You can get some that grow a little higher too. This is a plant that'll grow in our native precipitation. If you give it water, it'll get huge. If you kind of deny it water, it'll stay polite and grow a little more slowly. And this is what it might look like, right? Like it can take over a bank, keep weeds out, all with very low water. Really, most of the time wouldn't need supplemental irrigation. This one's called autumn amber because of the color. There's also Grollo sumac, which also is a similar habitat with a little different fall color. But I think I've seen a lot of these used really, really well in road medians, or like big areas that you want to cover, but you want a ground cover that's not turf, but will also keep out most of the weeds. This will do that over time. Oh gosh, I forgot. I have all my favorites in this talk. The last one here is Mountain Mahogany, which I've already said like two or three. These are my favorites. This is another one of my favorite shrubs. We should be planting more Mountain Mahogany. I don't know why we don't. You'll find this native in the foothills. It is an evergreen, so it keeps its needles all winter. So that's pretty cool. A broadleaf evergreen. Here's in our demonstration garden. It could tolerate shearing, so you can make a hedge out of it if you want. It's evergreen, so it keeps its needles into the winter. And I don't have a picture of it, but it gets this really cool, and you have to be like, again, it's super Western. It's not like smack you in the face showy, but it gets like this little airy flower and seed that like really is pretty in the morning and the evening when it's catching the light. If you ever hike in the open spaces in the metro, you've probably seen Mount Mahogany, whether you know it or not. And it again is very drought tolerant, and it's one that I think we could be planting a lot more of, a shrub we could be planting a lot more of, especially in low water use landscapes, but all over the Front Range. So that's just a smattering. I will at the end of this link a handout to that kind of lists all the trees with some of their pros and cons. It's a one pager. Try to keep it small. Um, so I said at the start of that the two most important things were species selection and planting. So I want to end with a brief discussion of tree planting. I do a ton of visits to look at trees, and the number one thing that I see go wrong is bad planting. Because there's just a lot of like bad myths about planting and misconceptions about how to plant a tree. This is a pretty good blueprint of what a properly planted tree should look like. It should be sitting in a hole that is 2 to 5 times the diameter of the root ball. The bigger the better. And that the hole should have a saucer shape to direct the roots out and up instead of reflecting them back across. If it's flat, it can reflect the root back off it. So saucer shaped, 2 to 5 times as wide as the tree's root ball. The flare of the tree and the first should be above grade, and the first root, real root, should like coming out of the flare should be at or a little above grade. Oftentimes, plants come deep from the nursery, meaning they're planted deep at the nursery, and you have to pull soil off the top of the root ball to expose the flare and to find where the first root is. So find them, and then those things are right at the flare should be above grade, and the first root should be right at or a little above grade. The backfill at the bottom of the hole needs to be tamped down or just undisturbed, not like dug up, so the tree will not settle over time. And then finally, when we backfill, we don't backfill over the top of the root ball fill. We leave the top of the root ball, rather. We leave the top of the root ball exposed and just kind of fill up to the side of the root ball of the plant. So water can more easily get in the root ball this way. It's more complicated than that, but that's the basic reason. We also do not recommend heavily amending your backfill. If you want to toss in a couple shovels of compost, that's fine. But remember, trees are going to have these big root systems. And so just like babying them in the planting hole can oftentimes set them back in the long run. It's again a little more complicated than that, but that's the short story there. So this is what a properly planted tree should look like. Big planting hole, big that's shallow enough that the flare is right above grade with the root right there at grade. After planting, care is a little tricky. So we say that it takes about a year per inch of trunk diameter for a tree to get established. So until a tree gets established, care is really important. The bigger the tree is, the longer it's going to take to get established and growing. So sometimes, actually almost always, starting with a smaller tree will yield a larger tree in the long run, or a larger tree more quickly, and just lead to more success in general. So for the first year, we want to water where the roots are. We say that in the first year, the roots have not left the ball, so we mainly focus on watering the root ball. And the second year, we say they're out into the backfill, so we water the root ball and the backfill. And if all goes well, we say by the third year, they're out into the native soil. And so now our normal irrigation is probably fine for them. Watering of new trees is the most important task, because if you kill or flush those fine feeder roots by missing a watering, let it dry out too much, you're going to set the tree back hugely. Underwater trees establish more slowly, they grow more slowly, and oftentimes they just don't establish and they die. So even though we're trying to save water, we want to make sure that we give the tree enough water to get established, or again, it's just a waste of a plant, and it took a lot of carbon to make that plant, so we do not want it to die due to lack of water. So for new trees, it's the opposite of mature trees. Frequent and light irrigation is best. Keep the root ball moist without letting it be sopping wet, or you want it to feel like a wrung out sponge, I guess is my best analogy. So frequent light irrigations are best for newly planted trees. And the best way to know when to water is to check the root ball. Use a screwdriver, use your finger, use a water meter, but use something to check the moisture level of the root ball and water when it starts to dry. It could be twice a week when it's the heat of summer. It might be every other week if the weather stays cool. And if it's raining, it may not be at all while it's raining. So there's no substitution for checking the root ball, and watering accordingly. And then I already said this, water where the roots are, and I already kind of went through that. First year there in the root ball, second year the backfill, third year out in native soil. Um, and winter watering is also the final thing I'll end on here is winter watering is also really important for newly planted trees and for evergreens pretty much for their whole lives. But for newly planted trees, winter watering is super important. And I just do it like this: get a little 5 gallon bucket of water, water it about once a month. It keeps the root system from drying out, which will make the tree establish more quickly. And it's especially critical for evergreens because they lose water from their needles all winter. Um, Remember that no tree is drought tolerant until it's established. Um, so like I always throw this, and this is where we'll end. I always throw this in here. This is a picture of a bur oak growing in Westminster, and the person who was growing this doesn't irrigate anymore. Now the tree's probably getting some water from neighbors' lawns and things like that, but they don't irrigate anymore. But back in the day, this tree was growing by an irrigation ditch. So this is a bur oak, and when it was growing by the irrigation ditch, it was just fine. So this is a tree that's tolerant of different watering levels. Um, that story is not as relevant to what I was trying to talk about as I thought it was, but no tree is a drought tolerant until it's established. So this is a very established bur oak, and it can survive with low watering. Also remember that even if we're in a period of watering restrictions from your irrigation supply, your water supplier, usually they let you water trees to some extent during those restrictions because they know trees are a long-term asset and are not as easy to replace as turf. So trees can be watered even during drought. So I've already talked about this stuff here. I guess I put it in there twice, but this is the picture. Um, you winter water once a month if we don't get moisture. I just put a reminder in my phone to do it. And it beeps to me at the first of the month and says, do you need to water your trees? And then I remember to water them. So I will leave it there. And that was the last slide. I knew I was at the last slide. I'll throw my email address here again. I have some other resources here for you. Plant Select, Denver Water, Northern Water, or all those organizations have really good websites. We just heard from Northern Water at the start of this. Your local utility may also have good resources. A lot of the ones in Adams County where I work do. Plant Talk Colorado has a lot of really short scripts for lay people. And then we have lots of fact sheets as extension. If you do CSU extension, garden fact sheets in Google, those will come up. So my email is there. If you have personal questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'm also happy to answer as many as we can here with the last of our time this evening.
Thank you so much, Eric. We have a lot of questions. I'll try to hit the ones that multiple people were asking. One is because of the Marshall Fire, and a lot of fire departments are really anti-juniper right now. So what is your stance on that? Because
Yeah, it's a good point. Firewise landscaping is definitely something that we need to be thinking about, and junipers are more ignitable than some other trees. I I'm not a firefighter, right? So, send your fire department to me. But I will tell you, in a fire like the Marshall Fire, I cannot logically believe that the difference between junipers in the landscape and pines in the landscape was why homes burned and homes didn't. Like at a fire that extreme, those throw choices don't matter. I think it's, you know, now if you live in the foothills and you just are trying to have a defensible space, you know, around your house because you live in constant fire danger, I would consider stuff like that. I would consider the species, and you can find good lists of ignition resistant plants for most of the local fire departments now. So I'm not going to swear off all junipers in subdivisions because of the Marshall Fire, because I think that was going to happen probably the conditions that day. Junipers or pines, it wouldn't have mattered. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'm not a fire expert, but that's my take, having been involved in the aftermath of that a little bit. So I think you're muted.
I sure am. So are the berry shrubs that you mentioned, I think it was like the gooseberry, the serviceberry, are those berry shrubs toxic to pets?
Ooh, I do not believe so, but you are out of my wheelhouse. So my advice would be to, if you have pets, to contact a veterinarian. There are also websites out there from the University of California, I believe, has one that lists poisonous plants for animals. I'm a plant person, and I do not believe any of those are pet poisonous, but I would not trust me. I would ask your vet on that one. So
Okay, thanks. And another question, at what elevation, the most of the trees that you were being presented, at what elevation, should people be planting them?
I think everything I listed goes to at least 6,500 feet. Some of those plants would go to higher elevations as well. If you are a higher elevation gardener, shoot me an email and I will get you a list of high elevation plants specifically. But
Great.
everything I showed, I think, is good to at least 6,500. If unless I'm forgetting something, they all should be good to 6,500.
And is it wise to trim large trees?
Well, that's a tough question. Trees do require pruning, like in a landscape setting. That's a whole nother talk. But they do require pruning. But it's best to get them to establish their structure when they're young through pruning, so they don't need so much pruning when they're older. But we oftentimes inherit trees that have problems as they're older. I would say if it's a large tree, I mean, I know this sounds like a cop-out answer, but you really should contact a certified arborist and get them involved. I really strongly believe that even the handiest person should not be pruning their own huge tree. It is super, super dangerous to be using saws and have big weights above your head. You should never use a ladder on a tree. Like, do not be the person who goes to the hospital and you have to tell the embarrassing story that, like, oh, I'm here because I was pruning my tree. It is super dangerous. So get a professional involved, would be my advice.
Sounds good. Here's a more detailed question that someone asked about raw new wood mulch. Was there any danger that it would suck the nitrogen out of the soil?
No, that's a really good question, but there has been good research that shows that wood mulch only leads to nitrogen depression. So like only the microbes decomposing the wood only consume the nitrogen in a very shallow area of the soil right near the surface. So wood mulch will not tie up nitrogen in any way that should affect landscape plants.
And this might be a arborist question, but someone has a big old ash tree and it has a split. It has two trunks that split about 3 feet above the ground. Is there anything the person needs to do to care for that in that case?
Yeah, if by split they mean like the wood of the tree actually split apart, there's not a ton you can do. Like that tree is going to be predisposed to failing for its life. It's going to be more likely to fall over for its life. So the important thing there is one to see if the tree fell, if you would care. Is it going to land on your house or your car or something like that? And if there's nothing it would fall on, maybe you just take the risk that the tree breaks someday. If it would fall on something you care about, probably get someone to remove it. A tree's wood is not like the wood of a tree is a 2x4, right? It's dead. A tree will never repair that wood. It will try to grow new wood around the wound, but it's never going to be as strong as it was. So, it's not like a bone that knits or something like that. That's not what trees do. So, again, you might think about getting a certified arborist involved. There are like cabling things they can do to like hold the tree together. That's only for really high value trees because you have to pay the arborist to come readjust the cabling for the life of the tree.
Mm,
So I wouldn't normally recommend it, but it might be an option. But generally speaking, you're doing triage about like what would happen if it failed and would I care. Um, so hopefully that helps.
Okay. And
Sorry about
another one, so, and this is, has to do with blue spruce. We've got a couple of people talking about a Colorado spruce that produces a lot of cones at the top of the tree and whether that's normal. And then the other person had their blue spruce uprooted. And will
Yeah.
it survive if they put it back in the ground?
I wish, but no. Once it's been thrown, if it's a young tree, if it's just a couple inches in diameter, maybe you can get it back to straight and take really good care of it and have it come through. If it was like a 1 foot in diameter tree or bigger, and it got thrown by that windstorm, it's unfortunately it's not going to make it. Um, it's not a good idea. Even if you could get it back upright and water it and keep it green, it's just going to fall over again in the next windstorm. And you probably can't get it upright and keep it green. So in that case, probably a goner. In terms of the cones, that's totally normal. Spruce actually put the female cones at the top of the tree and the male cones at the bottom of the tree so they don't cross-pollinate themselves as much. So, seeing cones, a lot of cones at the top of the tree is totally normal.
Good, good. I did not know that. Um, And then we had a couple of questions about advice you would give if somebody wants to take out the turf and they've got trees in the front yard and they want to be careful about that. And I know that for our lawn replacement program, they end up they stop using the sod cutter. They look for roots initially and they hand dig around the roots. Is
Yeah.
there any other advice or
No,
anything
that's
on
the
this
best you
front?
can do. So yeah, I would say I don't want to start like a controversy. So like but I will say that probably the safest way to get rid of grass around a tree without killing its roots is probably an herbicide that
Yeah.
doesn't kill the tree. So if you want to know about that, I can tell you more in a different setting. But so yeah, don't disturb the tree roots. You're 100% right. To the best of your ability, don't disturb them. And then the big thing is probably run like drip tape under the canopy of the tree and give that little area of your yard some more water because the tree is still going to need water. It's not as xeric as those plants you're putting in.
Okay.
So, run a drip tape around the canopy so you can give just the tree a little extra water so you don't lose it. That'd be my other tip on that one.
And for the last question, when is the best time to plant trees?
Yesterday, yeah, that's the saying, but yeah, right now, the spring. Um, so from the time you can work the soil to when the weather starts getting hot is the best time to plant trees. You can
Okay.
plant them anytime during the growing season. Don't plant evergreens in the fall is the other rule of thumb, but right now is the best time.
Great. Well, Eric, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm excited about investigating the gooseberries and the service berries because I do like the idea of having some fruit and having some shrubs. I think that sounds like fun.
Yeah, well, thanks
Um,
for having me. It was great.
Thank you everyone for attending and thank you again to Spencer Bernard and Northern Water for making this seminar possible. Our seminar series runs through August, so please, I put a link into the chat so you can sign up for other ones. I believe we have a Firewise one coming up and we have landscape templates. When you exit the webinar tonight, you will see a survey link pop up. And if you have a moment to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, keep an eye out tomorrow for an email from us with some follow-up resources and another link to the survey. We value your feedback, so please take a moment to fill that out. Otherwise, have a lovely evening. Thank you again for your participation and have a great evening.
Bye, everyone.